Hey everyone, welcome to episode 38 of the Ceres podcast. This episode is with Kate Nicholls, the CEO of UKHospitality. UKHospitality is the powerful voice representing the broad hospitality sector, covering everything from bars, coffee shops, contract catering, hotels, nightclubs, visitor attractions, and lots of other leisure venues. Its main aims are to represent the sector, promote the sector, share best practice, and create an unrivaled networking platform. This sector is a major contributor to the UK economy, employing 2.9 million people and generating 130 billion in economic activity, whilst paying 38 billion in taxation to fund important local and national services. Hospitality is the third largest private sector employer in the UK, double the size of financial services and bigger than automotive, pharmaceutical and aerospace combined. We recorded this episode on Friday the 13th of December, which was the day after the general election. By now everyone will know that the Prime Minister is Boris Johnson and has got a pretty good majority, which means his government should crack on and get Brexit sorted, to use their words. I'm not saying this to give an opinion or to upset any side, but there is no doubt that moving forward we need a solid, stable government for business and for services to thrive. This episode nearly never happened, as you will hear. I would say me and Kate were very tired, but we pushed along and there was a lot to talk about. I will also be posting a lot of the links and documents that we discussed, like Menu for Change, on our newsfeed at worldofceres.com. For those of you that don't know who pays the podcast bills, then head over to worldofceres.com. We've been updating our blogs, putting out transcripts of the podcasts, episode articles, updating our recipes for the fish cake mix, pea seasoning, and much, much, much more. Recently, we have added the article about Stuart Mitchell from Mitchell's Potatoes, and we have some more new ones coming soon. I would like to thank everyone who sent in questions for Andrew Crook from the National Federation of Fish Fryers, and we should be releasing this episode roughly this side of the new year. Shouldn't be too hard. I will also be doing my solo podcast, All Being Well, which will be a Q&A, and we might even have someone turn the tables on me and talk to me on the podcast in the new year. However, if I don't get enough questions for the solo podcast or we run out of time, then we can always bundle it on that interview. Thank you for subscribing. It's so easy just getting the episodes downloaded straight to your device. I hope you enjoy this episode with Kate Nicholls. Afternoon, Kate. Thank you for your time today.
Afternoon.
Just want to say thank you for coming on to the Ceres podcast. It's much appreciated.
Not a problem at all. It's great to have a chat.
So when we met in early October, we didn't know that there would be an election.
No.
And we didn't know that today the results would be out. So we didn't cancel. We just thought we'd carry on.
Yeah.
And as
sleep deprived.
Yeah, sleep deprived, both of us. And you didn't. You said you got 40 minutes sleep last night.
I got 40 minutes, yeah.
And I probably got about a couple of hours, but then a long drive to London. So many would say that it was the biggest sort of majority that the Conservatives have seen since 1987, which was Thatcher's third election, according to the BBC. I think it's fitting that we start our conversation with a little bit about the election and hopefully what it should all bring about. So what do you think about our now current Prime Minister?
Well, I think the key thing for a business perspective is that we've now got a degree of certainty and stability, which is what's been lacking for so long. And actually, we've forgotten really what normal government is like with the workable majority. I mean, it's a reasonable size majority, but in the scale of Tony Blair in 97 and Margaret Thatcher at her peak, this is not the landslides that they had. But we haven't had a stable majority working government since 2010. And if you think back just before that, when it was Gordon Brown, you had the financial crisis. So politics has not been normal for quite a long time, and certainly for some people's living memory. So I think from a business perspective, knowing that we've got that working majority, that we're going to have stability for 5 years, we're going to know where we're going on Brexit, whether you disagree or agree with it, you've got a clear plan and policy. You could see straight away last night the currency exchange that happened, and the fact that the pound gained 3 cents straight away on the back of the exit poll, and the strengthening of the markets this morning when they opened, that's business's response. So it's important because it locks in a bit of confidence. It's also important because it locks in consumer confidence, and that's what's held back, particularly in our sector, where you've got consumers who are really nervous about going out, who are not spending as much, who are not, even though their wages are growing, their disposable income is growing, we haven't seen that uptick in consumer expenditure. So from that point of view, it's positive. It also means you've got a government that is going to be able to set out a clear programme and know that they can get it through. And so hopefully, I don't want to paraphrase the Prime Minister, but we can get Brexit done and move on to some of the other issues that need addressing, like business rates, like what's happening in our high streets, our public services. All of those big issues, it feels as though the pause button has been lifted because it's been on pause for so long. And we haven't had an ability to go and talk in a normal way to the government about some of the priority issues for us, our workers and our customers.
A lot of people may not have liked his rhetoric, in terms of, the whole get Brexit done thing, but he was very honest about, if you want these services, business needs to do well. That was quite honest of him in a way, that it's not us against them, so that we all need to do well.
Yeah, and I think it's a voice for business that's been lacking, again, going back for about a decade. After we had the financial crash, politicians were nervous about being seen to support business or say that they were pro-business. It wasn't that they were anti, they just didn't want to say they were pro-business, and they didn't want to articulate a positive role for capitalism because of what had happened in the financial crash. And it's taken us a decade to get beyond that. So it's really refreshing to have the Prime Minister on the campaign trail saying, look, we want to invest in public services. If we're going to do that, we need a stable economy. And more importantly, we need businesses to be doing well because they are the generators of wealth. They're generating the taxes that allow us to do all of these things. So, if you want your investment in rural broadband, or you want your investment in road and rail infrastructure, or you want investment in the NHS, you're doing it off the back of business.
The interesting thing, which I said to you earlier, was that he literally, when he got the first time round elected as Prime Minister, not President, he literally just came out the gates, like really punching for the UK. And I think that's something, like you said, we'd not heard for a while. It was just very much like, keep our head down, don't say anything about business, encourage it slowly. But he just literally, not just pro-business, but pro-everything, pro-UK. And I think it was nice to hear, I mean, people do like that sense of optimism. It's sort of a human characteristic that you want to hear a positive vision of something that you can feel good about. And certainly that there was that message that came through, and it did have cut through in the election campaign. But I think really important to have that business is a force for good, and that sense of progressive capitalism, that actually if you want progressive policies, if you want to be radical, business can help you do it, is something that we haven't had for a very long time. And you are probably going back into the Thatcher era or Blair. Blair also recognised that. But we certainly haven't had it for a decade. So because we started at the elections, I just want to tell people a little bit about yourself. You are Kate Nicholls, CEO of UK Hospitality. UK Hospitality represents 700 companies operating around 70,000 venues that employs roughly 3.2 million people. All aspects of hospitality are covered: coffee shops, restaurants, hotels, pubs, apartments. Some firms you work with include Nando's, Butlins, Green King and so on. So tell us a little bit about your day-to-day. What does that sort of involve?
Well, no 2 days are the same, and a lot of days are quite unpredictable because you're responding to events. So, I mean, my role is to be the industry champion, to be the voice of the industry. And picking up on your point about Boris Johnson coming out and having that positive vision, my role is very much to promote the positive contribution that our sector makes, politically, culturally, economically, socially, as hospitality is a force for good, and get that message out there. So I am there to be the cheerleader for the industry, to champion its needs and concerns, and then to be the voice of the employer and the business operators to say things that either they can't say or that they don't want to say individually, but it's better articulated collectively. And so that will be talking about, the nitty-gritty of costs and the commercial pressures those businesses are under, and the need to have a more supportive and open and transparent regulatory regime to allow those businesses to thrive. So promote the reputation of the sector as a great place to grow, work and invest, prevent the unnecessary costs of doing business that hold businesses back from doing more in their community and investing in people and investing in properties, and then to provide that support, advice and guidance to help those small businesses in our sector particularly grow. And so my role's outward facing to the media and to the politicians, talk truth to power, and equally then from that relationship with politicians to get the information back, to translate it into a way of this is what you now need to do if you want to comply with the legislation or you want to position and protect your business going forward.
So immigration's a big concern for hospitality.
Yeah.
What's your worry about the points-based system?
Just to go back on sort of the Brexit point, I think one of the big things we've been able to do over the last 18 months, which is just how long UK Hospitality has been formed, is to be one of the 4 groups that is going to talk to the Prime Minister, to the Secretary of State for Environment and Food, to the Home Office about the impact of Brexit on our sector. And over the last year, I've had two meetings a week on Brexit and being the voice of the industry on those 2 key important points, our supply chain and also the sort of people point, immigration, but also our visitors. Are we going to draw up the fortress and make it more difficult for our tourists to come? And tourists spend in hospitality is about £27 billion a year. That's bigger than all our food and drink exports put together. So it's a really vital thing that ministers understand that, and that's what we've worked to do over the last 18 months. On the immigration point, I think we've really seen a big shift in the government policy and in the rhetoric, so that I'm more optimistic than I was that we'll get an immigration system that works for the needs of the economy as a whole, and in particular for hospitality. So the big concern around the points-based system or the previous skills-based system that they were talking about was a 30k salary threshold and a focus on the brightest and the best and the most talented and the most highly skilled. Doesn't really cut it for hospitality, where we've got large numbers of part-time workers and also jobs that are not considered to be the highest skills because they're not degree or above. And so a points-based system, if it's applied too rigidly, might still contain the worst elements of a focus on skills, but also I think has some opportunities for us. So the Australian points-based system values people with language skills and industries that need languages. And hospitality, because it's involved in tourism, we do need languages. Because we've got a diverse workforce, we do need languages for communicating back of house. It also does reflect areas and gives extra points if people are prepared to do jobs that UK workers are not prepared to do. And again, we have labour shortages. The challenges around a points-based system is cost, but it's also to do with the fact that it usually requires you to have a job offer before you come over. And actually that doesn't necessarily work for the volume that are coming over into the UK. So actually I was really reassured that in the last week of the campaign, the Prime Minister said that there would also be a 3rd tier, which is a low-skilled temporary route. And if we get those 3 tiers right and we get that focus on not just the skills that we need, but also the labour that we need to keep the economy functioning, then I think we can get the best of all worlds.
In the campaign, they didn't close anything off. They stayed very open-minded. And I think that they're not saying they've got all the answers, you know, and at least now with the majority, they can get the right advice and cut through that.
Yes, and I think inevitably in an election campaign, all politicians face both ways. They don't want to give a definitive answer because it might upset somebody who might vote for them. But I think what business now needs very rapidly is to sit around the table and work out the details of some of these big issues, whether that's the immigration system that they want to introduce in 12 months. So, you know, it's a big challenge to get your head around, and we need the detail now if you're going to do it in January 2021. Or we might have the conversation that says, could it be later so we get it right? Because it's important if we're doing it for the long term that we get it right. Or that's the detail of the trade deal, again, to be done within the next 12 months. Or business rates. You know, they've promised a root and branch review. We need to see what the detail of that looks like. So we need to put some flesh on the bones of the manifesto, which was incredibly positive and had an awful lot in there that we'd asked for as an industry and that would be really beneficial to the SMEs within our sector. So we need them to flesh that out.
So business rates have been largely underreported, really. Like, although within the industry, everyone's talking about it, from industry to people, nobody really hears about it. Nobody talks about it. Town centres are decimated, businesses are closing. What's your suggestion there?
Well, I think what we've managed to do over the last couple of years is to convince people that it does need to change, that the status quo is not an option. And going into the election, you had all the major parties promising a major review. The Tory party proposed some short-term reliefs for high street businesses and particularly SMEs, which will come forward in the next year, we anticipate, as part of the budget. And then we're really looking at the medium to longer term when the next revaluation cycle comes through in 2021. And there, I think we need to find a way that we cut the overall business rates bill, because we're trying to get the same amount of money, £27 billion, from an ever-shrinking pool of businesses that are increasingly moving out of the town and city centres. So the big ones that are left in the town and city centres occupying the expensive premises are really hospitality. Yeah. And it really isn't fair that we have to continue to bear the burden for most of the other businesses. So although we're 5% of GDP, we pay about 15 to 17% of all business rates in the UK. So we need to find a way of bringing in the digital economy, either through a digital services tax so that local services are funded by that, or we look at taxing fulfillment centres in a different way. Yep. So dark kitchens or Amazon delivery distribution hubs, they're actually doing sales from those businesses. They are different from a booker cash and carry, which is a very basic warehousing model, but they're taxed on the same basis because our system isn't nuanced enough. So we need some nuance that gets in there that captures the value of the work that they're doing from those sites rather than just the pure land value.
Because they would like to tell you that it's just a warehouse and they're just moving. Yeah, but actually they're driving some serious sales through those.
They are. And I think in hospitality, less so in restaurants and cafes where it's more floor space. But in the rest of hospitality, our business rates are based on turnover or have a turnover element to them, which actually means you're penalising success, because as soon as you invest in that premises, and we are actually the only sector that's investing in the high street, it's about 1% of all of our turnover is reinvested in the high street. As soon as you do that, your business rates bill goes up. So where's the incentive to grow? Where's the incentive to be successful? Where's the incentive to invest? And that's what we need to get into the business rate system, so that we reduce the amount that's taken and we port the good operators.
What are your thoughts on hospitality staff shortages? Again, we've spoken to a lot of people about this in the podcast, and no one's really articulated it properly. And where do you think it's come from, and where do you sort of see it getting better? And if we look at it, if we can split that into domestically and also maybe abroad as well, because I think there's two different arguments there. Because why don't domestic people want to really be in hospitality?
Okay, so there's quite a bit to unbundle there.
Sorry.
It's fine. I think the starting point is a lot of people in our industry talk about skills shortages, and I don't think we do have genuine skills shortages, because I think that the huge benefit of hospitality is it can take anybody at any skill level and upskill them and give them a meaningful career path. So you can go from no qualifications to running your own premises within 2 years if you're bright and want to, and move very quickly up. And we have lots of examples of bar to boardroom success and career progression. So I don't necessarily think it's a skills shortage, because we can train anybody. What we've got in the UK at the moment, and it's become quite acute, is that we've got a labour shortage. That's partly due to demographics. So we had a drop-off in the birth rate, and we have 200,000 fewer 18 to 24-year-olds, UK-born 18 to 24-year-olds, entering the jobs market next year. And we don't come out of that until 2030, and that's simply demographics and birth rate. And about 60% of our workforce across hospitality as a whole will be in that 18 to 24 age bracket. So we're very good at giving people their first taste of work, and we're very good at employing large numbers of young people. If we suddenly stop producing large numbers of young people because the birth rate drops off, then you've got a problem. And I think, the challenge then is that you've got that perfect storm of a large number of foreign workers not being attracted to come to the UK post the referendum vote. Hopefully the stability and some reassurances around the fact that they're welcome, they can stay, that if they come over they will get settled status might help. But there was undoubtedly a drop-off initially. after 2016. So you have fewer UK EU workers coming in. You have a very tight immigration system for the rest of the world that was pushed through by Theresa May as Home Secretary. You have a decline in the birth rate, which means we've got no young people or very fewer young people. And you've got an incredibly successful economy that has got record levels of employment. Put that all together and we've got really acute labour shortages. They've often been there, and there are some underlying reasons, which you allude to. But actually, the thing that's made it acute over the last 2 years is those factors all coming together at the same time as the hospitality sector has grown exponentially.
Yeah.
So our employment in hospitality has grown by about 20% since 2010. Lots of new restaurant openings. We were opening 5 a week. So, you've got lots of new outlets coming into the market and a limited pool of people.
A recent podcast guest said to me is that we're very imperialistic in this country and we like to be served and not to serve. And he said that's one of the reasons why he thinks that a lot of young people don't come through hospitality, because their parents maybe look down on it a little bit.
Potentially, but I mean, I'm a mum of 2 Gen Zs, and I sit in parents' evenings with lots of other mums. Unless you're saying you're going to be a doctor, a lawyer, those kind of big professions, no career is good enough for your mum. So lots of industries fail the mum's test, if you want to phrase it like that. We do need to do some work to overcome it, and I think we need to start talking about it as being a career rather than a job, and demonstrating that we've got real career progression. So I'm very pleased that we managed to secure a tourism and hospitality sector deal from the government, which is going to get government backing for us to do just that over a 3-year period, promote the positives of a career in hospitality. The other thing that I would say, which is a big change, when I was growing up, lots of us had part-time Saturday jobs, either when we were in school or when we were going through university. It was quite common to work while you were at university. It's 2 things that have changed. One is the Labour Party decided that most people should remain in education until they were 18.
It was this Tony Blair era.
Tony Blair. Yeah. So Tony Blair changed that and said you should really be in education, which meant that you didn't get lots of people leaving school at 16 and providing that stream of people who were working either on a casual basis or full-time. And it meant that vocational education was not as valued, and we devalued it for a long period of time, which will take a long time to overcome. Second thing that they did was to move from being 10% of the population in the early 1990s, 10% of the population went to university. Their aspiration was 50%. So again, you push back the time period when young people come out and start work from being 60, some at 16, more at 18. Now they're mainly coming out at 21. If you couple that with the fact that if they are at university, they've got large student debts, so you're going to make sure that every moment at university counts rather than going and working. Yeah. So I think you've got out of the habit of that casual working and getting you into the mindset of work. And we picked up a lot of people on the way, people who were working on a casual basis who then decided that they loved it and would stay.
Yeah. So essentially before that, people would go to uni and have a job. What you're saying is what's changed a little bit is that that's just not the case anymore, really.
I think it's less. Yeah. It's less. But, I was talking to a couple of people who are now running their own companies. One is Chris Hill at New World Trading Company, who was doing, I think it was an engineering degree at Nottingham, but certainly in the sciences side, and working in a bar while he was at university, which is a lot of us did, and then decided he loved it, and after he did his degree, carried on, and now runs a hugely successful, award-winning Sunday Times top 10, I think, employer. I think it's harder if you don't have that ability to do some work at university or to get a taster of what our industry could offer you. You're coming out at 21 cold.
So 0 hours, if we look at that a little bit, because it sort of works here a little bit. I don't know why they were invented, but I know that a lot of students were using them because they could then be flexible, do as much. And I know they've probably been abused, there's no doubt. But getting rid of them, if the government gets rid of them, would that be a negative? Would it be a negative against getting younger people into working in hospitality, let's say? Because if they want to do 6 hours, they can do 6 hours.
Yeah.
But if you're saying you've now got to do 16 minimum,
Yes, and the flexibility of it changes week to week is something that a lot of young people want. And in our sector where people have moved away from 0 hours and given the workers the choice to have a fixed hours contract, it's not very attractive to those workers. They don't want that. They like the flexibility. I think banning 0 hours contracts altogether would be definitely a retrograde step, and it would stop a lot of women returners and older workers who also like that part-time work. But if you look at the Gen Zs that are coming through, they are looking for plurality in their career at an earlier age. And these are the positives we ought to be selling about hospitality. The reason that 0 hours contracts came about was there was quite a bit of tightening of employment law, some of it coming out of Europe, which said you should specify in an employment contract what hours were worked. And if you couldn't specify it, if it changed, then you move towards a zero. So they're not necessarily a bad thing. And I think, as you rightly say, there have been some abuses, but you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater when it's something that is valued, hugely valued by a lot of our team members.
So if anything, they could just make a couple of tweaks to that system.
They could. I mean, I think, some of the areas that do raise concerns and where with a little bit of more sensitive handling, we could keep the benefits and communicate better with our teams. People don't like having late notice of their shift, either late notice of what their rotas are or late notice of any changes. So, that kind of thing doesn't help if people are being told on a Sunday what their shift patterns are. Yeah. Equally, I think there have been some where there's been an exclusivity clause, and that is difficult for people who want to work in many different areas. But equally, if you look at it and you tighten it up too rigidly, people will just go and work in the gig economy to get that flexibility. And actually, there's greater opportunities for people in the hospitality sector and greater opportunities to move towards full-time or increase your hours than there is in the gig economy.
And driving people towards the gig economy, from what I'm seeing or hearing, is that there isn't a lot of protections there at the moment.
No.
And they're self-employed, and there's no support from the employer really, or the state, let's say.
Yeah, well, you don't get sick pay, you don't get any statutory maternity pay or paternity pay if you move into that stage of your life. You don't get pensions, you don't get enhanced NIC protection because you're self-employed. So you really are slightly more isolated and vulnerable and on your own than you are if you are working part-time and flexibly for a good, rewarding employer. And you, crucially, in the gig economy, don't have the opportunity to flip into a full-time role or to step up and say, what, my time of life has changed. I now do want a full-time job. I want to move into management. And you can't progress. In order of priority, surely the gig economy takes more priority over 0 hour contracts in that respect. From a political point of view, I would argue so, yes. Yeah. If you're going to be looking at government, at areas that need additional protection or need a greater eye casting over them, the whole sharing economy, gig economy, that's the area that you've got issues coming up. And, in broader hospitality issues, you've got Airbnb, which is carving out residential units, making it more commercially viable to let on an Airbnb than it is to let to a long-term tenant. So how do our low-paid workers find housing near enough to their work if Airbnb is taking an awful lot of those flats? That's the kind of area that government needs to look at and needs to get a grip of, because we've often got 20th century, or in the case of business rates, probably 19th century regulation trying to deal with a 21st century digital economy. And we need to be more progressive in the way that we're dealing with that to make sure that we capture the benefits that digital provides to all of us without sacrificing the positives of the traditional businesses and the bricks and mortar.
Yeah, and I think if you look at, I know it's only anecdotal, but a customer of mine who uses Deliveroo, and again, I'm sure it's across a lot of them, they said that the staff work so hard on those bikes that they have no time for lunch, and they literally, some people will just take food that they're delivering to eat because there's no provision for a break, there's no nothing. It's just literally, well, you're self-employed, so you better get this done. And well, whether it's like that, I don't know. Maybe it's just the fact that they're self-employed and they want to get paid and they just do it. And so I think
that's right. People will decide to structure their working day accordingly. When I first started, I worked in the House of Commons and the European Parliament simultaneously, and I ended up sort of doing 2 or 3 jobs during the day and moving between the two premises and different parts. So I was probably working ludicrous hours, but that was my choice to do it because I was getting what I wanted was experience and insight into the workings of politics, and I couldn't get it any other way. And in the same way, people who are working in the gig economy probably do like the flexibility and do like the ability to work right the way through the lunch break and make money rather than sitting for an hour and doing nothing. That's people's choice. I think all I would say is that government needs to just make sure the regulation is applied fairly to both so that it's a fair choice that those people are making and we're not pushing them away from a more stable employment environment.
A few contentious issues we've had sort of this year and last year is allergens. And there's been a few deaths. I'm not sure how many a year, probably 200 a year? No, not 200 a year.
No, it's very small.
Yeah, very small. 200 issues a year maybe?
There's often 200 issues. Yeah. But actually the number of people who have life-threatening allergies is thankfully really small. And the number of times that those allergies are mishandled and it ends up in a death or a serious illness, again, is reassuringly small, but we need to do much more to make sure that those customers are protected and that they can protect, more importantly, they can protect themselves because they've got to manage their risk.
So at the moment, we've got full allergen labelling on food that's packed on site. Has that showed any difficulties anywhere? Has that been an issue anywhere?
Yeah, I mean, currently it's food that's pre-packed for sale to the customer, and if that's been going through retail outlets, that's covered and it's on pack labelling. You've got then the provision of information that needs to happen in a catered environment or an on-trade environment where it can be provided and doesn't have to be provided at point of sale. And we had a little bit of a grey area in between, which has been resolved with Natasha's Law. So Natasha's Law is the one that arising from the Pret case and is trying to address this issue that says if it's pre-packed direct sale, the customer can just pick it off a shelf. It should have full ingredient labelling. That's not come into effect yet, but there are challenges that we've got with the existing legislation. So I went onto the Food Standards Agency Twitter feed to look at an alert. They put an alert out about E. coli in salads, so I went to get the information, and I was struck by the fact that the top 10 tweets that they put out in the last week were all about product withdrawals for incorrect allergen information provided by major manufacturers to major supermarkets. So labelling on its own isn't going to address some of the issues of concern, and it still is too easy to get cross-contamination or to get labels wrong, and it was mislabelling. So I think we need to work carefully to make sure that lots of the SMEs in our sector, if big companies can't get this right, the SMEs in our sector are going to need help and support to make sure that they are getting it right and that we're crystal clear with the consumer what's happening. So there are challenges around the existing legislation. There will be challenges for SMEs in taking forward Natasha's Law. We have until 2021 before that takes effect. Some of the major multiples are starting to move in that space. So Pret were the first, and they've moved to provide full ingredient labelling. Greggs are now looking to do the same in their site. Hopefully that will give us quite a lot of learnings to help support the SMEs as they go forward. Genuine delis and genuine small sandwich shops who are making it fresh for the customer, they're not going to be covered. There's still quite a lot of grey areas that need to be worked through in the guidance, and we haven't been able to work through that while the election's been going forward.
Yeah. And then there's Owen's Law.
Yes.
And so that's another one, and that's for non-pre-packed food.
Yes. So that's for your restaurants and a quick service or takeaway.
And that would be on the menu then,
I guess. The menu. So Owen, a very sad case again, but very like Natasha's, and these are horrific human tragedies where things go wrong and mistakes are made. And Owen was a case with Byron where the information was not communicated properly, and he had a very severe dairy allergy and ate buttermilk chicken. So the suggestion was that all of the full ingredient declaration that Natasha's Law had brought in for prepackaged food, they wanted to see that same information on a menu or on a point of sale. So if you were a small kebab shop or pizza takeaway, that would be on the board behind your head when you go in and order, but it would basically be there. So at the moment, all that information can be provided on request. It doesn't have to be on the menu. For the allergens. This would go further. It would not just be allergens, it would be ingredients. So for a lot of small premises or restaurants or catering establishments that are cooking daily fresh from scratch or have a daily changing menu, that would be incredibly costly to implement. And I'm not sure whether it would give meaningful information to a lot of customers. So we're quite concerned about that. And also we're very concerned about the fact that even with the best systems in place, you cannot fully eliminate risk. And in small kitchens, there is always going to be a danger of cross-contamination. So we can't give a categoric assurance, nor can the major manufacturers in the factories can't give categoric assurances that there's going to be no contamination.
They can guarantee that they'll try everything they can possibly do to rule it out.
Yes.
But then what happens if something goes wrong?
Yes.
So that's the problem, isn't it? There's that grey area where a mistake does happen because we are humans and there is human error.
Yes.
And I was reading somewhere that someone wanted to implement a system where there's no human intervention. And apparently it's barcodes all the way. And I was sort of thinking, well, who then monitors it when it goes wrong?
Yes.
Yeah.
And equally, systems go wrong. As
Yeah.
I say, I go back to the Food Standards Agency website. It has a lot of those cases on where something's got contaminated in the factory and it isn't labelled. Then it becomes really unhelpful because the factory puts may contain or produced in an environment
and that frustrates people with allergens.
It does, because, I'll give you an example, hot chocolate powder, that it doesn't have dairy in it. Suddenly, if the supplier decides that they've changed their production method and just for safety's sake will say, produced in a factory that may handle dairy as well, suddenly you have to have a choice as a caterer. Do I go with that? Do I put that disclaimer on? Or do I take it out and substitute a product? And the other thing we do have is that we have very complicated supply chains. Thankfully, as a result of Brexit, government now understands how complicated our supply chains are. But as an individual operator, even relatively large operators, sit round a table and you talk to Wagamama and Pizza Express and Wasabi and those people, as well as Pret, they still struggle with the fact that their supplier can substitute or change the recipe and not tell them until it gets delivered. And then suddenly you find you've got a product you can't put on the shelf because you haven't got proper labels for it, or is inadvertently containing an allergen. So, and as you say, mistakes can happen. We're relying upon our staff then to suddenly check and scrutinise a new label when we've already always assumed it was safe.
It's worth noting as well that allergens aren't bad. They're just bad for certain people. Certain allergens are bad for certain people.
Yes.
And I think that it can be quite scary when you hear the word allergen.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I've got a number of allergies myself, and I've got friends who have quite severe allergies. We can't take away from the fact that the principal responsibility is that person themselves to make sure that they are not eating food. We know we've got a vulnerable group because we know that most of the cases that do come to court where there's been a problem, either a fatality or a serious allergic reaction, almost all of them are late teens, early 20s. So this is a group of customers who are risk takers. They're risk takers in their general lives.
What's that age bracket?
That age bracket is much more likely
live forever, aren't we, at that age?
Exactly. Much more, and they're coming straight out of a home setting. So actually, up until 16, if you've got an allergic child, the parent is going to have much more scrutiny of what they're eating. It's when they go to eat out on their own, and are they going to take the risk, or are they going to be too embarrassed to ask or not know what to ask? And that's where I think we need to be better at giving information, and I think the industry can work together. And one of the things we can do as a trade body is to provide that common guidance and advice on compliance to the operators, common systems and common labelling, so that those vulnerable consumers know what they're looking for.
One of my customers is a baker, and he said that a mother comes in one day and she brings in a little boy, about 10 years old, maybe 8 years old, and then rings up a few days later shouting, saying that her son got ill, not from the bread that he consumed, but just from standing in the bake. He's a celiac and severely allergic. And she took him in, and she was blaming him. And he said, I would have never known that, you brought him into a bakery where there's flour in the air. And I think that you sort of see sometimes on Twitter, a lot of restaurants get quite, this is slightly different, they get quite frustrated with people with allergens or so-called allergens because they are actually allergic. They just don't fancy it, or it's a diet. So how do you it's a minefield. So
it is. All
of these little stories make chefs or bakers or people in the food industry respect it less, when really they need to respect it more. It's a minefield. How do you navigate that?
Well, I think we need to put anything to do with legislation. We can't just assume that legislation and labelling and requirements are going to resolve this issue. We need greater public information and education so that the public is aware of what the difference is between an allergy, an intolerance and a lifestyle choice. And we need to make sure that they are communicating that carefully to the team members who are serving them. Then we can train our staff. We can make sure that those team members have all the information they need. We can make sure that they're asking the right questions. But if somebody who is, as you say, comes into a restaurant and says, I can't eat dairy, can't eat or
won't.
Allergic or won't eat or would prefer not to. And that becomes, the other thing is that for a lot of customers, they look for the gluten-free or the vegetarian or as a synonym for being dairy-free and being non-allergic. And actually, they need to become more careful than that.
I think one of the things that I see quite regularly is nut intolerance. And I think you see a lot of chefs and they'll look at the check and it's like nut allergy. So they'll go for all the meals and at the end it's a dessert and they'll order a dessert with nuts in it. So the waiter will go back and say, "Oh, madam, sir, are you sure about this? Because it's got nuts in it." "Oh, yeah, I like nuts in my dessert. I just didn't want it in my food." And I think that's where they get pretty frustrated, I think, because they've gone through a whole system making sure they've used clean utensils. And then at the end, it's just...
It's a personal preference.
So what you're saying really is what we need is a slight change in all the systems, but also a healthy dose of self-responsibility. So someone goes up to the counter and says, "Look, I can't have X. Can you just make sure that I have a sandwich without that?"
Yes.
Thank you. And so everyone's sort of doing...
Yes, and also an expectation then, a bit more of a realistic expectation that not every outlet is going to be able to, and not every dish is going to be capable of being modified to meet your requirements. Perhaps that's where sometimes we're our own worst enemy. As an industry, we do like to say yes, and we do like to say that we can help. And I saw something, again, sort of on social media, and I'm wary about social media is not real life, but there was a chef had posted a slip for a private dining room for 10 people, and there were 10 dietary preferences on there. Now, it was a set menu, but even so, you just sort of think, it becomes too complicated. So are we setting ourselves up for a fall by setting the bar too high to suggest we can modify everything?
I think the company that I see the most and respect the most in this instance is probably McDonald's. I think that they haven't ran down the route of doing gluten-free. And one comment I see all the time is, "Oh, well, they do it in Spain. Oh, well, they do it in Spain." And I saw someone say, "Well, they just can't do it in the UK. Just be happy that they're not risking it on you." And I think they've just stuck to doing what they do safely. And I think that they've not gone down the route of trying to change all their systems. And I'm sure if they can, they will. But I think it's quite good in a way that they've just stuck to what they do in a way. And I'm sure maybe one day they might. But I think at the moment, it's just very sensible. It's just, here's what we do. If you can't eat it, we're really sorry. And I think maybe sometimes you've got to say that. A friend of mine's got a fish and chip shop and he will say, "I can't do gluten-free. I've got wheat everywhere. I just can't do it." I wonder if the celiacs respect that. I know you're not going to get their pound, but at the same time, we'll just talk about celiacs in this instance.
Well, but I think that's a really good example, because actually there's lots of people who want to be gluten-free or need to be gluten-free because there's an intolerance. There is a huge world of difference between needing to be gluten-free or being gluten intolerant and being celiac, which is actually a disease. It's not an allergy. And I think that, for them, the clarity and the certainty is absolute. You cannot say that you can do something that is gluten-free, but if it's cooked in an environment where there's flour around, it's not going to be. But that wouldn't matter necessarily for somebody who's gluten intolerant. It is going to be massively problematic for a celiac. So I think we do need to have better consumer information. We do need to be focused on staff training, to have detailed conversations and to not be afraid to interrogate those customers. So it's quite routine now when I go out to eat, people will ask if there's any allergies. But actually, the best restaurants and they're not necessarily fine dining or very fancy, some of them have been tiny independents, when one of our party has said, "Yes, I do," they've not just taken that at face value, but they've asked the details and they've asked what it really means and what do you need to see, and is it an intolerance? How much can you tolerate? Those kind of things. And that's where I think we can help our team members to get it right.
Moving on to sugar tax and calorie caps. A few years ago, Denmark did a fat tax. It was a bit of a failure. I think they took it away in the end. Over here, we've now got the sugar tax on drinks. Is it just a punitive way to tax people? You know, does it actually change anything? I'm a big fan of just, in my view, just letting people... Well, I suppose there's health risks, like smoking, for argument's sake, and you can see how that, you know, some would argue that sugar's the same. I don't know. What do you think? What's your thoughts on this?
I think it does depend on the product. So tax and in the form of duty on cigarettes and alcohol, it goes back to price elasticity of demand. And there's certain times when you can price it so high that it does nudge behaviour. But actually, I'm not sure that that's the case with things like soft drinks. If you really want a full-fat Coke... or full sugar Coke, I should say. People are prepared to pay for it. Yeah. And I'm very much of the fact that, that it should be about customer choice. I think the evidence internationally from where people have put calorie labelling or sugar taxes in, or fat taxes in, is that it doesn't change consumption. Or it distorts consumption. They get it from somewhere else, or they willingly pay to have what they want because they're making that choice. I think what the sugar tax did do, for some brands better than others, was that it accelerated the process of product reformulation amongst a lot of manufacturers. So for things like Coke or Iron Brew, there is no way around it. And actually, it should have been the case for Lucozade. Lucozade did try and go sugar-free, and they had such a horrendous backlash from customers. Things like Sprite, Tango, Fanta, those things, they just modified the product and reduced the sugar levels overall so that it fell outside the levy. So for a customer, there was no change, and it didn't really change the taste or the feel in the mouth. So it did spur a lot of innovation in that area to reduce sugar overall. But the calorie labelling and calorie caps, when it's been tried in places like New York, overall calorie consumption stays the same. And actually it can lead to some poorer decision-making by consumers where they save up in order to have a pudding when they might not have otherwise done, or people choose a lower calorie product. Ham and cheese panini instead of a halloumi wrap was one of the examples that I came across when I did it with some civil servants. If you say to them, what do you think is the healthy option? They say a halloumi wrap. When you show them the calorie is higher in the halloumi wrap because it's got sweet chilli sauce. So it's the sweet chilli sauce that does it. But it's still a healthier option than a ham and cheese panini with processed ham and processed cheese. So, that is more saturated fat. So I think you can get some distortive effects. And, as a mum of 2 young girls, I'm really worried about calorie messages because it can result in some very strange eating habits.
And you see also where some people have to live frugally because they have to or they want to, and they try and get as much calories for their money as well. So that's the other problem as well, is that you're not just eating what you think, what you fancy, let's say. You think, well, actually, for £2, I can have 600
fill
calories.
up.
Yeah, and so you see a bit of that as well. But I think Mexico's the biggest consumer of soft drinks.
Yes.
And they tried this tax, and 2 years later they're saying, well, they've realised it doesn't work. So I think, I don't know. I think, is it a little bit of virtue signalling? Is it genuine NHS demands?
With the current government, I don't see it going very much further, to be honest, because I think that there's a real battle inside the Tory party over, sort of free markets versus interventionists. I don't see this Tory administration as being particularly nanny state. So I think that you'll see that moving away. And it's led by campaign groups, and it's led by Public Health England.
Yeah, I suppose you're right. This government isn't going to be very much virtue signallers, are they, really? No. They don't seem the type, put it that way.
Well, I don't think they're finger waggers. It's
No.
not necessarily virtue signalling. It's finger wagging and telling people what to do. That's really where it flips over from public education and information. And I think I'm all for providing people with good information. But actually what they need to do, and one of the problems that I think we face as an industry, but also as a society, is we've taken away lots of stuff to do with cooking and home economics from school curriculums. So people don't get an idea when they're growing up how to make food, where does food come from, what's a reasonable portion. Whereas when I did home economics, and I hated doing it, but when I was forced to do it, you did get a sense of this is a balanced meal. This is how much protein, vegetables, whatever. They just don't get that. No. And I think the government would be better spent focusing its attention on giving those children good quality information to make informed lifestyle decisions as they get older.
Makes complete sense. And also, maybe if they're handling food at that age as well, they might
well come and work in the industry.
That makes sense. I did food technology, and I think that's what brought me this way. I really loved it.
Yeah, and actually for a lot of those children, that might be the thing at school that sparks their passion. How do you know what you're passionate about if nobody's ever exposed you to it?
Another tricky one that's been sort of skirting away over the years, and it's VAT on hot food, and it's specific. Well, it's on a lot of things, but on hot food specifically, do you see a case where they can probably, well, at least there's a case where they can look at moving it over to all out of home food and then reducing it because there'd be a wider net to collect from? Or is there other options that you guys think are better?
I think the challenge with VAT has always been that it's such a big cost to the Exchequer. Yeah. And actually, when George Osborne tried to do the pasty tax, he had a real political backlash. And I think that politicians don't like things like that. So it is challenging for them to do. I think post-Brexit, they have much more scope and flexibility for looking creatively at the whole of the tax regime. At the moment, VAT is set within the EU parameters and they can't change it, so that they can only go from either 20% or 5%. Yeah. But, cutting VAT on food and tourism, beds, whatever, it is one of those issues that's been looked at, but it still comes with about £10 billion cost to the Exchequer. It would cost them £11 billion to wipe out all student debt. So, if you look at how big a bill that is in comparison with other priorities that they may feel they want to make in terms of NHS spending, that's the thing that always gives pause for thought on VAT. So, yes, there will be a chance to do that post-Brexit, to look creatively at it. Yes, if you brought in more out-of-home food and equalised it, then you might have the opportunity to widen the tax base and get money in to reduce that cost. But it's still going to be a significant cost to the Treasury.
I just think there's a bit of an unfairness to the whole thing.
Undoubtedly.
Yeah, because if they say that if you're eating out, hot food especially, as a takeaway, there's 20% on that. Well, and obviously restaurant and hotels and so on. However, if you go buy a sandwich, which I could easily make myself at home, I don't pay VAT on the sandwich, do I? Or whatever it is from Greggs or so on. And so I just think that, if they widen the net a little bit and then dropped it, it doesn't have to be 5%, obviously. But
it does at the moment, but post-Brexit, it could be something different. So we would encourage them to look creatively at it, because what they want to do is what they should be wanting to do is to support progressive capitalist businesses that are generating the jobs and economic growth and investing in local communities, and actually in that sense, hospitality is that virtuous circle, because we are labour intensive, we're property intensive, we need to be in high footfall areas. So we are going to invest in those high streets and town centres that they want us to. So incentivise those businesses and use the tax regime creatively to do so.
Well, I think if you used to hypothetically drop the VAT on food, as in lower it, and then have better rate system, you could see how that would stimulate that sort of economy. You could see how you'd be employing more people, you'd be serving more people, and so on and so on and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where I think government hasn't been very good in the past in looking holistically at those kind of interventions, and we'd encourage them to do so.
Why has the hospitality industry always been a bit of a sitting target? There's no hospitality minister. You've mentioned that we're a huge industry, 130 billion turnover, 5% of the GDP, industry full of entrepreneurs, 90% of hospitality businesses are local SMEs. There's just so many facts that show how big this industry is, but there's a tourism minister, and that's where it ends. So I guess you knock on their door a little bit, but then do you propose sort of a hospitality and tourism minister?
Yes. I mean, that's one of the things we always talk to the government about, and I think that there's 2 points as to why it's not got the respect that it has done in the past, but actually now it is getting it. You've already touched on one of it. Hospitality, 90% of the businesses are SMEs. So if you are going to do something that hits retailing or manufacturing, or they're big plants, they're pretty obvious. If you want to talk retailing, you go and talk to 4 companies and they make a difference. If you want to go and talk financial services, you can go and talk to 4 businesses. we've got about 150,000 businesses across tourism and hospitality. If you're looking at core hospitality, it's about 100,000. So it's difficult for government to get its head around and to get it as a touch point. If you close a Peugeot plant, you immediately have a loss to that community that is very big and visible. It's less visible when you're closing 1,600 sites across the high street, which is probably around about the numbers that have been lost. I think there's 6,000 job losses in hospitality on the high street over the last year, which is more than Peugeot when they closed Ellesmere Port, which is more than. So partly it's because we're self-healing. Our job losses are picked up somewhere else. We always have a steady stream of entrepreneurs. We have a churn of new openings that are always coming through. And the second reason is that we had nobody to represent hospitality until UK Hospitality was formed 18 months ago. So you've got these small businesses that are a plethora of them and multiple voices talking on their behalf and going to government with different messages, different stats, different asks. So that ability to bring everybody together under one umbrella organisation is incredibly powerful, and it has been transformational over the last year. So government is listening to us and is recognising that the industry is the size and scale it was. But until we were formed and created that spreadsheet of stats that you've just quoted from, you forgot one, £39 billion worth of tax, which is the entire defence budget or the entire social care budget. There's £1 in every 3 goes back to the Exchequer in tax, which really fits with the government's narrative of these are the businesses that are the wealth generators that are paying for your public services. Now, until we quantified that 18 months ago, they had no idea about that, and there wasn't that visibility. And again, you say 130 billion, that's bigger than aerospace, automotive and pharmaceuticals put together. The spend from tourists is bigger than food and drink exports. Wow. So until you have one voice going into government talking coherently about those big contributions that we make, and then saying, and by the way, we could do so much more if you only did this. And also making sure that it's not a wish list that is 10 to 20 asks in length, is realistic, is pragmatic. My job and my background as a professional lobbyist is to look for the win-win. What is the government trying to achieve and how can we get them there quicker? If you can align your ask with that, then you've got a chance of success. If you keep going at the government talking about something that is totally off their agenda or doesn't fit with what they're trying to achieve, the last year has been quite typical that really they're fixated about Brexit. How are they going to get that vote through? How are they going to get a Brexit deal working? What do we need to do to make sure industries can continue? You've got to talk to government in the language that they understand and on the issues that they want to engage on.
Makes complete sense because, for example, when the whole Brexit thing was going off and everyone was sort of throwing their toys out the pram, you'd hear Jaguar say, well, if this happens, we're leaving. And you'll hear someone else say, Toyota or Honda, we're going to leave, Nissan. But you never hear, well, what about the hospitality industry? Like, you just quantified those figures. And I'm thinking they're big figures,
But you use it differently. So that's a stick, Jaguar and those lot. Ours is, we can't leave.
Yeah, no,
we're here.
Yeah.
And we're at the bedrock of your economy nationally, and we're at the bedrock of your communities locally. So you can ignore us or do something on Brexit that doesn't work for us, and you will damage an industry that is going to be integral going forward. So if you do the worst possible thing and Jaguar leaves, who's going to pick up the pieces? Who's going to employ those people? Who's going to continue your economic growth? So if you look at the economy as a whole, it's growing at about 1%, and it has been for the last couple of years. Hospitality is currently growing at 5.5%, and it's forecast to continue to do the same. We've added 20% more jobs over the last 5 to 10 years, and we're forecast to continue to do the same if you give us the right conditions for growth. So actually it can be a strength if you turn it, and that's what I say about what is it that the government's priority is going forward. And actually, if you have as an ambition, which Boris Johnson has said several times, a global internationalist, open Britain, active on the world stage, you need to be communicating that and having the tourists to come.
Yeah.
That's how we are your shop window when you get here. So you attract those tourists, and that's what he's trying to do when he's talking about it. And then when they get here, we're a literal shop window. So you just need to turn it into the way that they can understand how your concerns as a sector of the economy are actually integral to what they're trying to do.
How do you find aggregators like your Deliveroo, and companies like that, all the middlemen as such, or middle women, how do you find that they're changing the industry for your members, or they might even be your members, but how do you find, what's the change with the marketplace at the moment?
Well, I think that those disruptors, and it cuts across hotels as well, because you've got online travel agents and you've got Airbnb, as I've mentioned before. All of those disruptors are catalysts to the traditional sector improving its offer and working out what its USP is. And that's around experience and selling experience. And it's what we know customers want to buy into, that people are looking for. And so I think, they often get criticised. They have been helpful in stopping us from being complacent and continuing to innovate and invest in the areas we want. Also, technology is a great enabler, and it helps us to reach different audiences. I actually think the biggest competition that we've got as a sector is not each other. It's people sitting at home on their sofa, eating a ready meal or something that they've cooked themselves, or food that they've bought in the supermarket, and watching the X Factor on TV or Strictly. And, that's what the industry faced in 2008-9 when we went through the credit crunch. And actually what we need to do is to encourage people to come out of their homes.
Dining experiences.
Yeah. Well, just get out of your home. We are the out-of-home sector. We are the area where you have fun outside of your own house. And we're also your home from home when you're out and about. What those digital disruptors do is to help people get that different experience, or to see what a different experience could be. So I always try and look for the positives in it and try and see it as a positive rather than bemoaning the negative.
I'd imagine that someone like Deliveroo, all of these aggregators, not to pick one out, you could see how they would sort of chisel away at sort of ready meals.
Yeah, well, I think that, yes, they are undoubtedly. When you look at the stats in the takeaway market and the out-of-home market, Deliveroo at the moment is not replacing restaurant meals.
Okay.
I still think as a customer, you're still at that customer journey. Do I want to go out or do I want to stay at home? And I think where they're taking market share from is the posh ready meals, the Marks and Spencer's £10 meal deals, and the Waitrose ones where you are having a sort of indulgent experience. That's where I think it's eating into. Or it's replacing traditional takeaway, so when you went round the corner to your local Indian or Chinese takeaway. At the moment, it seems to be largely incremental to restaurant sales, because customers are still looking for a restaurant experience or a pub experience or a cafe experience. So I think that we just need to be careful that it doesn't eat that market share from when you are coming out. We have to make sure that the restaurant experience is still special, and we focus on that, and that they get something that they cannot possibly get from Deliveroo.
I also read somewhere that, and I might have read it or you told me, I read a lot and listen a lot, but that pubs are doing better than casual dining.
Yes.
What's that down to, do you think? Because pubs went through a really tough time, didn't they? So have they found their mojo now? They
did. I think they have found their mojo. They went through a really tough time in 2008-9. They had exactly the same problems of perfect storm that we've seen on the high street for casual dining over the last couple of years. So they had regulatory change, they had an oversupply, they had credit crunch and consumer confidence falling off a cliff. All happened in 2008. So you had a smoking ban. You had about 66,000 pubs when we really were declining in the amount we were drinking, so that we had too much in the estate, and too many pubs that were therefore underinvested and weren't offering a different experience to the consumer. And we're down to about 49,000 pubs now. So we have lost a lot, but the ones that are there are more sustainable, more innovative, better invested, are working on the experience, whether that's food or craft beer or craft cocktails. So it's a much more differentiated offer. It's all relative as well. This is relatively, they are having better like-for-likes than the restaurants did during the same period when the restaurant like-for-likes went negative. Some of it is weather-related. Some of it is football-related. It's no surprise that they did really, really well when we had a long, hot summer and we had the World Cup. People go to beer gardens and they go to pubs. They don't go and sit in restaurants. It's one of those things. Restaurant like-for-likes are picking up now. but they did go through a very bad patch. And I think it was partly to do with Brexit and the impact on consumer confidence and consumers not being willing to spend, and the consumer uncertainty, and also that prices had to go up as a result, and that turned a lot of people off. But even so, pubs are doing better in like-for-likes. I still don't think pubs or restaurants are doing the like-for-likes they need to cover their regular... Yeah, they're not covering their regulatory costs, so they're standing still. If you've got like-for-like sales, I think the latest tracker that came out was like-for-likes were up 1%. So yes, it's growth, but you probably need 4 or 5% just to stand still with business rates and wage rate increases.
And I read a little bit of the UK Hospitality Menu for Change, which is an article, well, not a booklet you guys published. And there's quite a few good changes in there that you've recommended. Has anybody sat down yet from the government to look at those, or is it still a bit early?
I think it's still a bit early in order to go through them in any great detail. A lot of those were areas that we've been talking to the government about before the general election, and particularly the areas around immigration, national living wage, employment taxes, property taxes more generally, and also the skills agenda. So it's no surprise that, although we were delighted when the Conservative manifesto came out and picked up our top 4 asks, are all reflected there. But it's things that we would need to work with the government for, and that's why it wasn't just a manifesto for this election, it was a programme for areas to support the sector over the next 5 years. So we're looking forward to sitting down as soon as they get back and going through that. But one of the things we did do, given the way this election was going and the fact that there were lots of MPs standing down, we asked all of our members to send it to their local candidates, ask people to come in to visit their establishment during the election campaign. We've had about 48 new MPs that came through and went to a hospitality venue and met the people there, heard the concerns. We've got another 48 that are lined up to do after the election. So it's about making sure that operators are there talking to their local representatives, telling them what their concerns are.
Because a lot of these local MPs would not even know about, for example, a friend of mine rang up Sky News and spoke to Boris, and he was telling him about the VAT system and how it's not very fair, and Boris had no idea. You could tell he was right. You're thinking it over, and you think, well, they can't know everything.
No,
we can't expect them to, and they're always going to look at where, who's shouting the loudest. That's where they're always going to look, aren't they? Absolutely. And instead of being frustrated that hospitality doesn't get a share of voice or leaving it to the trade associations, we need the operators as well to be engaging at a local level and just saying, look, here we are, we're big, we're important, we matter, and we'll do the detail. We'll be your civil service in comparison to the government civil service, and we'll do all the detail. But on the ground, just saying, this is an important small business in your constituency. I employ 10 people, I generate this amount of money for the local community. That's what politicians need to hear, and we need to educate them about how valuable we are. And just off the topic a little bit, did you see recently there was a takeaway food trader, and he was arguing with the school teacher because the school teachers wouldn't let the kids out to go and eat at his takeaway? And I thought to myself, and he was almost saying that they've got a little bit of a monopoly on school children.
Yeah.
Is that something you hear from your members, or does it not really make it up the tree that much?
I haven't heard that in particular. But I have heard, the big complaint tends to be careers and information and advice in schools. And these teachers are incredibly under pressure. And as you say, they are the gatekeepers. Yeah. So again, we just need to equip them with the information. If we don't give them that information, how can they possibly talk to people about local opportunities and local careers?
Why do people look down, maybe suspect lobbyists? And we sort of discussed, and you mentioned you're a lobbyist, so I'm not just making that up. So that's the first one. Why do you think there's this sort of distrust? Is it the Americanization of lobbyists, or how we hear about them? Maybe
I think it's the Americanization, and also the fact that back in the early 90s, the very first Cash for Questions scandal that hit before we had the expenses scandal, there was Cash for Questions, and that was lobbyists as well. So I think we're always suspicious of vested interests. Maybe it's just a healthy dose of British scepticism, but we're always a bit nervous about people trying to talk and influence MPs. And you'll often hear the health lobby use it quite disparagingly, that, how can government possibly sit down with industry? How can that possibly be good? How can that possibly be right? And we don't really understand that, as you say, MPs and ministers can't be all over all the detail, can't understand the implications, particularly around businesses, nor can the civil service, who do a fantastic job, but they're only as good as the information they're given. So particularly when it comes to explaining how business works, lobbyists are vital to making sure we get the best possible legislation. They're only a problem when they become visible and it comes to the fore. But I think, you see programmes like The West Wing or House of Cards, and that just gives us all a bad name.
And the second part to that question is, so some of your members are global. And again, there's a global suspicion of large brands, a domestic suspicion of global large brands. And again, where do you think that comes from? You hear a lot of the time, they come over here, they don't pay tax and things like that. Yeah, I don't feel that that's a fair representation of all global brands that are in the UK.
No, I think we go through cycles in the UK as customers as to whether we trust brands or we don't trust brands, and what type of brands we do trust. So I think that there is a cyclical thing that's going on there. But I think that goes back to the point you were making about at the very start when we were talking about the election and how different it was to have an articulation of a pro-business message. As I say, for over a decade, business has been painted as the bad guy. The big banks, the bankers were to blame for the financial.
Normal business, though, are they?
They aren't, but it seeps through, and also that it has been a message from the Labour Party over 3 successive general elections that somehow big business was bad, or big business was, the bankers became synonymous with big business. It's that sort of sense of the shadowy figures in the city.
Well, I've never seen a hotel chain or a McDonald's get a bailout.
No.
So or a Starbucks. No. It just doesn't happen, does it?
No. Or equally, there's a lot of people who argue for support and bailouts for farmers, and I'm not saying that they don't deserve it, but again, that's a very small part of the economy that is deemed to be worthy of support, but nobody's talking about it for hospitality. And equally, the idea of what is a small business, politicians tend to have this idea of it being really, really micro, and small business is good and it's craft and it's sort of one man and a dog, and then there's these huge international conglomerates, and they forget that there's this mid-tier, which is where hospitality sits and plays, that is at neither of those extremes, that is not getting recognised and is not getting supported.
Similar to the middle class population in some respects.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a good analogy. But
I think it probably is. It's sort of, they're not the just about managing and the sort of people who really need help and support because they're teetering on the brink, and they're not the ones that are so big that they can take care of themselves and they're like the super rich, but they're just sort of the engine room of the economy that just churns away, happens every time, and whatever you throw at it, it's going to be there. It's part of our background and lifestyle, and it tends to be the sort of retail and those kind of businesses as well, and I think it just gets forgotten.
Kate, I'm just conscious of your time because you do have to go soon, but I've just got a couple of more questions.
Okay.
So if you could have one change made next year, because we're nearly done this year.
In the next 3 weeks.
Yeah. Well, that's a bit of a rush. But if you could have one change next year and then 2 changes over the course of the 5-year government process, what would they be?
Well, I think the one thing you could do this year is to move ahead and deal with the Brexit issue and end that uncertainty. If you move into next year and we get into the budget, we've got to have a root and branch reform of business rates. It's got to be a fundamental review. George Osborne promised it in 2015. Sajid Javid and Boris Johnson have got to deliver it, and they've got to deliver it next year. And then longer term, I think we all want to increase pay for the lowest paid. It's got to be done in a way that is sustainable and doesn't damage business ability to invest, because the worst thing you can do is to just focus on pay to the exclusion of the rest of the business profitability and viability and the job viability. So I think what we need to do is to lift the NIC threshold, take the lowest paid out of tax altogether, which will boost their disposable income, and equalise it for employers and employees NIC, then the employers will be able to invest in all the good things the government wants us to invest in. We'll be able to invest in pay, we'll be able to invest in training without it just going straight back to the Treasury in the form of tax, whether that's the apprenticeship levy or NICs or a business tax. That's what we want to do. So that would be my thing to do in the next year. Is my two things is business rates and NICs, and then longer term, but they need to start it this year, is to look at the digital economy and digital services tax, so that we make sure we have a business tax regime that incentivises investment and is fit for purpose for the modern economy.
Brilliant, that's a fantastic answer. I love it.
So there we go, and then that's all sorted.
Well, you have something else to do. It doesn't stop there, does it?
No.
Last one, is there a book that you'd recommend?
Well, we had this conversation before, because I did say I am an avid reader, but I'm not very good at reading business books. So is it sort of, which one do you want me to go for? But, my absolute favourite book that I go back to time and time again is Wuthering Heights, and I think it's a brilliant book for anybody to read. However, I'm conscious that that's not very helpful for a lot of people in business. The other one that was given to me when I took over as chief executive by one of my friends, Anne Elliott from Elliott Marketing, she gave me Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In, and I think that would be a good read for anybody in business, particularly the men in business, to understand what's happening with the whole of the workforce and to have a better understanding of diversity and inclusivity, because I do believe that if we get it right for the 50% of the population that are currently not necessarily represented, those women will be better at thinking about diversity for BAME, disabled and LGBTQ. And the other thing is that rather than reading business stuff, I tend to do a lot of listening to podcasts. So Jim Sullivan and Supersonic, Mark, is fantastic. I'd recommend both of those, particularly Mark in Supersonic for marketing issues to do with hospitality. Listen to it rather than read.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, because I've been listening to a lot of Tim Harford, and he's an economist, and I love everything. I'm not very well schooled, so anything he's saying, I'm listening to everything he's saying.
Yeah.
It's really amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your time.
No problem at all.
Amazing.
Thank you so much.
I'll let you carry on, because I'm sure you've got a very busy day.
That's okay, given that we're both sleep deprived. We can both go and have a rest now.
Hide under the table.
Exactly.
Have a great day.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.